We talked about phenomenology last time, and I tried to make the case that phenomenology, at least in part, was an attempt to include the entire domain of subjective experience inside the definition of reality. When Rogers talked about mental health, he was speaking of something that superseded just rational coherence. I mean, Rogers also touched on a topic that's become very well developed since the time of Rogers, which is the topic of embodied cognition. It's become increasingly clear to artificial intelligence researchers particularly that the Enlightenment idea of rationality as like a disembodied sort of spiritual function is wrong in principle. And I think that's because the way the brain sets itself up with the body is the way that we discussed when we were talking about Piaget. It's that the mind is built from motor actions up, and the concepts that the mind uses aren't abstract categories that describe reality. They're more like tools that allow us to do things in the world. And so they're predicated, their validity is predicated on the fact that we have a body. And one of the things that Rogers was trying to emphasize, and I think there's a long history of this in Western thought over the last few thousand years, that there are faculties of apprehension that are higher than rationality, and some of those are embodied. So it's a variant of Freudian theory, because the Freudians, of course, thought that it was necessary to attend to emotions and motivational states and to integrate them with the ego. But it takes that idea further, in some sense, by treating the inputs of the body, so motivational states and emotions, but also perhaps the capacity to mirror other people, as a prerequisite for mental health. And so the other thing that Rogers emphasizes is to pay attention to how it is that your experiential field is manifesting itself while you speak and interact with other people. And he was hoping and striving towards a kind of unification that was analogous to the unification that I described to you that Jung talked about in his last book. There's another practical element to this that I should tell you that I think is unbelievably useful. And we talked last time a little bit about the necessity of listening to people and techniques that you could use to do that in the effort to improve your communications and also to improve the degree to which you were gathering information that was practically useful to you and corrective. But with the Rogerian techniques, to some degree, you can do the same thing with regards to the relationship between your intellectual rationality, which is sort of your knowledge as represented at the highest level of verbal abstraction, and the platform on which that knowledge is hypothetically implemented. So you can imagine in the Piagetian mode of development, you start to learn how to move, and then those movements are chained in ever more complex sequences, and those sequences start to become representable abstractly, so that you can describe yourself, for example, as a good person, and hypothetically, as you decompose the idea of good person down towards specific actions, that whole hierarchy is internally consistent in that you're a good person in your self-representation, but you also enact all the things that a good person would enact. And then there's no flaws in the entire hierarchy. But the weird thing about having an intelligence that's dissociable, which means that you can think up things without acting them out, is that you can also formulate self-representations and ideas that aren't fully integrated with the manner in which you actually act. So you can have a concept of yourself and even an ideological framework that's only vaguely related to the programming that's been instantiated in your body. And Rogers would consider that, he has a technical term for it. It's a form of internal disharmony. Noncongruence, that's his term. And the non-congruence idea is a very interesting one because, in my experience, you can feel it. So, and here's something that you can try as an experiment. And I think it's as effective an experiment as the listening experiment that we discussed last time. So, it's very common for modern people, especially intelligent modern people, to identify themselves with the contents of their intellect. But that's a strange thing to do in many ways, because first of all, obviously, you're not just the contents of your intellect, you're also your emotions and your motivations and your body and so forth, and your embeddedness within a social context. But especially if you're intelligent, it's tempting to identify yourself with the contents of your intellect. But there's no reason to assume whatsoever that those contents are in fact congruent with the programming of your body, or even with its natural inclinations. And that's partly because the fact that you can abstract also means that you can learn abstractly, and that means you can pull in concepts from the world at a level of abstraction that may have virtually nothing to do with you. And that's certainly the case if you're educated, because you read all sorts of things, and you know, the reading and all the investigating that you do at an abstract level allows you to have theories about being and theories about yourself, but there's no necessity that those theories about being and yourself have any basis in who or what you actually are. And so that makes you inauthentic. That's the existential perspective. And the Rogerian perspective would be incongruent. You're not a singular entity at all the multiple levels at which you exist. And that can cause conflict. So, for example, maybe you're acting out an ideology because you're convinced of its rational integrity and coherence and utility, but that ideology doesn't fulfill you as an individual. Now, that's certainly an existential claim. It's a fundamental existential claim. In fact, as we'll talk about in the next lecture, there are thinkers like Solzhenitsyn who've ascribed the worst catastrophes of the 20th century to exactly that kind of inauthenticity, which is the development of a coherent and rational ideology, say like a communist ideology, and then the attempt to force that on the world and on people, despite the fact that the rational formulation and the reality of the people and the world have very little in common. Now, how would you detect your own inauthenticity or your own incongruence? Well, Rogers had this idea that he called subception, which was maybe something that you might regard as a sixth sense. It's sort of like a propriocentric perception. And that's the perception that you have of your body as it's reacting and localized in time and space. And so it's sort of like touch, the feeling, but it's your sense of how you're reacting internally and where you are. And a lot of that is subserved by the autonomic nervous system, which is reporting to you about various states of being in your body. Rogers believed that you could use the information that's being provided to you from your body, sort of bottom up, to determine when you were being inauthentic or non-congruent. And I've thought about this for a long time and tried to sort it out in a practical manner, and what I've concluded is this. You can try this for a couple of weeks. It's an extremely interesting exercise. So, you sort of have to detach yourself from your thoughts and what you say. So you got to assume, you start by assuming that what you say and what you think is not necessarily you. And of course that's just the case, because a lot of what you think, in fact, most of what you think and most of what you say are the opinions of other people. They're things you've read or things people have told you, and you know, that's a benefit in some ways because you get all those thoughts that other people have spent a long time formulating, but it's a disadvantage in that it's not exactly you. Okay, so you detach yourself from that. You're no longer your thoughts or the things that you say, or maybe you're no longer all of them. And now what you're going to try to find out is which of your thoughts and things that you say are you, and maybe so you can not utilize the rest, or maybe so that you can correct the rest, because they're not representative of yourself as an integrated being. They don't take everything into account. My sense has been that you can tell when you're saying something that's not authentic by feeling out whether or not it makes you weak or strong. Now, you know, sometimes when you're conversing with people, you can say something that embarrasses yourself. Now, Nietzsche said, for example, everyone has perjured themselves at least once in the attempt to maintain their good name. Something like that. It's not an exact quote, but I've got the gist of it right. So maybe you're saying things to impress someone, or you're saying things to remain part of your political group or your social group or whatever, or maybe you have attributes, personal attributes that might be positive that you're ashamed of, and so you're not going to speak about them. So there's a falseness about your self-representation. Watch for 2 weeks and see. Make a rule that if you start to say something and it makes you feel weak, it's hard to describe exactly what that means. To me, what it means is that I can feel things coming apart, sort of in my midsection, so I think it's an autonomic phenomena. And the subjective sense is of falsehood. It's like I've just stepped off the solid ground and onto something that doesn't support me well, and it feels like a self-betrayal. So that's existential inauthenticity. You can feel it right away. And then the rule is, shut up if that happens. Stop talking. And then feel around and see if you can find some words that you can say in that situation that don't produce that sensation. And it's like, you see this played out in different forms of drama. So there's a scene in The Lord of the Rings, for example, where I believe it's Gollum and Bilbo. It's The Lord of the Rings. It's Bilbo. It's The Lord of the Rings, not The Hobbit, because The Hobbit's Frodo, right? So it's Bilbo. Have I got it wrong? It's the other way around? Okay, so Gollum and Frodo, yes, are going across this swamp. And the swamp is essentially full of dead souls. And they have to step very carefully in order to not fall off the track. And the stones are sort of hidden underneath the surface. And the implication there is that in order to follow a trail properly, you have to pick your ground very carefully, and you have to test it to see if it's solid, or you'll slip off into this, well, essentially what it is chaos. You'll slip off into chaos. And that's a dramatic representation of what I'm suggesting to you. It's like, all you have to do is notice, and you have to pay attention. And so to some degree, what you're doing, in fact, is you're making your capacity to pay attention superordinate to your capacity to think and to speak.